I'm a longtime resident of northern Alabama. I spent my childhood partially in Huntsville and partially up in Memphis. My late father was a medical doctor, as well as a hunter and an outdoorsman. He instilled in me from a very early age a profound fascination with the natural world around us. It is this interest which led me to study biology at MTSU and work now as a wildlife biologist for the state of Tennessee, implementing conservation programs throughout the state's public lands, which include much of northern Alabama. I am also an amateur cryptozoologist. I don't claim to be an expert by any means, but since moving back home, I've become increasingly interested in the subject and have become something of a local expert here on it in North Alabama. I've even given a few talks on the subject to local groups. Cryptozoology is the study of animals which are rumored to exist, but have not yet been verified by modern science. These things are included like Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, the Champ. It also includes lesser-known cryptids like the skunk ape, for example, or the goatman. I bring all of this up because here in northern Alabama, we have our own cryptids, like the lizard man. In fact, the first recorded sighting of the lizard man was in 1988, just south of Bishopville, South Carolina. Since then, there have been numerous sightings reported all throughout the southeast, but most of them have been in South Carolina and Georgia. The majority of these reports are from rural, wooded areas. The creature is typically described as being around 7 feet tall, with a green scaly body and a long serpent-like tail. As I said, I'm not an expert on cryptids by any means, but I have done some research on lizard man, and here are my thoughts. There is no doubt that there is something out there. Whether it's a new species of animal or a previously undiscovered cryptid, there is definitely something strange happening in the woods of northern Alabama. The descriptions of the lizard man are extremely varied. This could be because different people are seeing different things, or it could be because lizard man is purposely changing his appearance to avoid being seen, or there are different varieties of lizard man. As it stands, there is no physical evidence of its existence, like footprints or photographs. However, this does not mean he does not exist, but it does make it more difficult to prove. I think it's possible that the lizard man is a real creature, but I also think it's possible he is merely a product of the human imagination. I don't know what it is exactly, and I'm not going to try and say for sure. I'm convinced, though, that there is something real going on here in the southern states. I'm a retired Air Force colonel, and my wife is a retired Army lieutenant colonel. We have spent our entire lives around military bases and in the company of people who keep their eyes open and alert. I also have experience in intelligence work and have a healthy respect for the kind of things that go bump in the night. But this night was different. I will never forget. August 19th, 2002. Before all this happened, my parents had always talked about the possibility of living dinosaurs. Ever since I was a kid that I could remember, they would talk about seeing dinosaurs when they were kids. They would tell us stories about how Grandpa was in a plane crash in South America. He helped rescue some missionaries that ended up capturing a live dinosaur. My mom claimed it looked something like out of Jurassic Park. My parents were driving to Montgomery, Alabama, from Pensacola, Florida. It was late, and they had been on the road for a few hours. They had just crossed over the border into Alabama when something ran out in front of their car, causing them to swerve and avoid hitting it. My father thought it was some kind of animal, but my mom insisted that she saw this thing standing upright and standing by the side of the road as they drove past it. She began telling my father, there is no animal that could stand upright like that, and if it was not a person, then what was it? Before he could answer her, though, they both spotted another creature standing off in the distance, right near some swampland, not far from where this thing had run out in front of them. This one was taller and looked far more like a lizard or a dinosaur than the man. They sped away really quick and never really talked about it much again. My mother, who spoke to me about it, claimed its eyes were sunk into its head and had a mouth full of crocodilian teeth. It had a thick neck, extended out of the body at an angle. It almost reminded her of somebody who was hunched over, like the hunchback, but with really long arms. The face appeared more leathery, although my father said he might have seen some sort of crest or ridge on the top of its head, but my mom did not say anything about this detail, so I'm not sure if she caught that too. My dad just keeps saying he doesn't know what they saw that night, but he swears it was not human. He also says that whatever was standing near the swamps looked more like a dinosaur. I'm not sure what to make of it myself. I know my parents are the type of people to make up stories. They clearly both saw something that night they cannot explain. And I wanted to let you know, my parents have seen the creature again since that night. They were driving down a similar road a few years later, and they saw a similar creature standing near the swamps. This time, they got a better look at it and described it to be identical like the one that they had seen years prior. My dad was successful in taking a picture of it, but it turned out far too blurry to even be relevant or to even pass around. I'm not sure what to make it of all myself, but I thought you should know about their experiences. I am an undergraduate student at the University of North Florida. My field is in anthropology, but I've always had a fascination with pseudoscience and cryptozoology. My name is not very relevant to this report, so I'll just leave it out. I was born and raised in Northeast Florida, which you know is Jacksonville, or the First Coast. It's part of a state that always held a mystery to me. Stories passed on by my grandfathers, who spent most of their lives here, about encounters with Bigfoot and Sasquatch, men in black, along with more common urban legends like the Goat Man and Skunk Ape, are still told by older residents to this day. I had actually planned on migrating away from Jacksonville once I graduated high school back in 2010, but 4 years later, I'm still here. I think that this place has a hold on me, some sort of weird magnetism, and lately, it seems like the mysteries have been revealing themselves to me in small bits and pieces, usually when I'm least expecting it. A few weeks ago, I was out driving around at night, probably 1:30 in the morning, cruising, listening to music. I was on a pretty rural road that runs through Nassau County, about an hour north of Jacksonville. It's definitely not that kind of place you'd expect to see somebody driving around, especially at time of night. I was up on a sharp curve in the road that had just crested a hill when I saw a car parked on the side of the road. It was turned off and the driver's side door was open. I slowed down as I approached, expecting to see somebody who maybe needed help. But as I got closer, I could see that there was someone standing next to the car, but it was not a person. It appeared to be a lizard man. I slammed on my brakes, swerving around the car, landing in a ditch on the other side of the road. I watched in my rearview mirror in horror as this thing walked towards my car, slowly, almost cautiously. I frantically fumbled with my phone to call 911, but before I could even get it out of my pocket, this thing was gone. I never saw it again, but I know what I saw. It doesn't help. I'm surrounded by swamps. I'm really not sure what to make of it. Luckily, I was okay, but I thought it was good to share my experience with somebody who might understand. Oh, and it appeared that the car that I saw had been abandoned, somehow. His face, though, was very strange. It was like a cross between a lizard and a human, but also not exactly the same as either one. Deep, sunken-in eyes into the head, glowing this green-yellow in the headlights of my car. The skin on its face looked scaly and thick, like some sort of primitive armor plating. There was no hair on the body, but a strange mane that ran from the middle of his forehead down to the small of his back. I did not notice any ears or nose, but he did have a very human-looking lips and teeth. He definitely was not wearing anything, other than what you can imagine. The whole encounter only lasted a few seconds, but it felt like it lasted hours. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever experienced, and I still have trouble sleeping at night because of it. To reiterate, the car was on the side of the road, and its driver's side door was open, but nobody was inside. This lizard thing walked up to my vehicle as I approached. He came walking out of the swamps right next to where the car was parked. After my experience, I looked around and noticed that there were no signs of anybody else being in the area with us. No footprints, blood trails, nothing. Also, about a week before this happened, I had somewhat of a strange encounter outside my home. Anyway, I had also spoken with my uncle, who lives in the area where I saw the lizard man. He told me that there have been reports of this thing in that area for years. Nobody knows what it is or what it's doing there. I'm beginning to think that maybe this creature is more than just a mere legend. Since this has happened, I've become more and more paranoid every time I leave my house. I don't like going out at night anymore. I'm afraid that if I ever run into this thing, it'll kill me. It's been hard to sleep knowing that this creature is lurking out in the darkness somewhere. You know, I've asked myself that question 1,000 times and I still don't know. It was like it wasn't human in the sense that we use the word in modern society. But at the same time, it also seemed like something more than just an animal, either. I don't think you could classify this thing as being evil, but it definitely felt malicious. I'm not crazy. If anything, the opposite might be true. I've never heard of lizardmen before this happened, so there's no way I could have dreamed up these details beforehand to fool people into believing me. I'd like to consider myself an experienced outdoorsman, but I know many people say that about themselves. Anyhow, I've been hunting and fishing since I was a small lad. I know what I'm seeing when I see it. I also proudly have a degree in wildlife and fishery science. Tonight, October 9th, 2017, while driving home from work, I spotted something in the bayous near my house. And I'm gonna sound crazy here, but it looked like an alligator humanoid. It was around dusk, and it was standing maybe 30 yards away from me, on the opposite bank. It appeared probably 7 feet tall, had a long snout and greenish skin. It did not move as I drove past it. I'm not sure what it was. It had a long snout with small, sharp teeth. The eyes are what bothered me the most. I've always hunted and fished up to my waist in the bayou, but I was never brave enough to go deeper than that. My family has owned the land along there for close to 100 years now, since it became a part of the National Wildlife Refuge, but now, I know it's really out there. I got a good look at it, and can add some more specific details. The alligator humanoid thing had brownish-gray skin. It hung in wrinkled folds, like an alligator's hide. It was roughly 8 to 9 feet tall, long snout, shorter ears covered with greenish-gray scales, but I had a hard time making out other features because of the fading light. I know the place where I saw it well. It's an area right next to our own house that borders a large, swampy part of the bayou. This part stretches on for miles back into a land owned by a friend of ours. It lives in this bayou, which drains into another even bigger one about 30 miles long. It's a murky, dark place, and I've never seen anything quite like it before. That's why I contacted you. Since seeing it, I've been having trouble sleeping. I just keep thinking about what it could have done to me had I gotten out of my car and got closer. I've also been having nightmares. I've always hunted and fished up to my waist in the bayou, but I was never brave enough to go deeper. My family has owned that land there for the refuge close to 100 years. I'm not sure how to process all this. I wanted to share my encounter that happened yesterday while hunting in South Carolina. I know you are interested in Bigfoot sightings, but this was something different. I have spoken with other hunters about it. They think I'm crazy, so I'll just keep it short until I can get some proper feedback from someone who has a real open mind. Here's the story. My friend, Adam, was walking ahead of me up a hill several hundred yards away when he stopped, turned around and shouted for me to hurry due to the deer that were close by. As I got closer, he told me not to look behind him or run into him because there was a large reptilian creature standing beside him, looking down at its feet. The thing did not snarl, growl, or make any noise at all. It just stood there looking at him with a very surprised and puzzled look. He said immediately he thought of the movie Anaconda and began to panic. The creature was easily 8 to 10 feet tall, very muscular with greenish-gray skin. The eyes were piercing. He told me he had an urge to shoot it, but he knew he could not. There were other hunters in the area. He said the creature finally turned and walked off into the woods behind him, disappearing from sight. I'm not sure what this thing was, but it was definitely not human. I'm curious if you or anybody else has ever heard of anything remotely similar. The face was also very wide and flat, with a ridge above the eyes extending back to a small bony protrusion, similar to a horn growing from the top of the head. The eye sockets were oval, tilted up slightly and set about halfway back on each side of the skull. It had a few holes in place of a nose, but no real nasal cavity opening that we can make out. There were also no visible ears or lips, and the skin was a light greenish gray, similar to what you would see on a crocodile, I guess. The head, back, legs, and tail looked like they were covered with dark brown or black scales or plates, similar again to how crocodiles are arranged. When it turned around, I could see that its chest area was also covered in scales, but these were much larger and more numerous than those covering the rest of its body. Its belly, sides, and inner thighs did not appear to be scaled. It did not make any noise at all. It never opened its mouth and did not bear any teeth. It never made any movements toward us at all, or try to attack, grab, or eat anything. It just stood there, looking. Ace said he immediately thought of the movie Anaconda, like I said, and was very panicked. The thing did not snarl, growl, or make any noise. So I'll just keep it as short as I can until I can get some feedback from somebody who has an open mind. I'm not sure what this was, but I don't believe it was a person in a costume at all. This happened on June 12th, 1994, on US 59 going northbound at around 2 a.m. I was a police officer with the local PD. I'm not allowed to disclose the actual PD name. I was working the night shift, driving northbound. I saw what looked like a large man crawling out of the ditch on the east side of the highway. I turned around to investigate, and when I got closer, I realized it wasn't a man, it was a lizard-looking thing. I stopped my patrol car and got out to investigate. As I got closer, I could see that it was definitely a lizard, but not just any lizard, but a giant, man-like lizard. 8 to 9 feet long. It had a long tail and was very buff, very muscular. It must have seen me coming, because it took off, darting on the east side of the highway. I was surprised to see such a creature out in the open like that. I had never seen anything like this before. I imagine that it was probably some type of escaped science experiment gone wrong. I'm glad this thing did not run into my vehicle while I was driving. It would have been quite a shock. Anyway, I would be very interested in hearing any other stories or sightings of this creature. I know that it's definitely something I will not forget. Also, I was just thinking about this incident the other day, and I remembered. We had also received a report of a strange creature on the same night, but on a different highway. I have no idea if it's related or not, but I thought you might want to know. It's definitely possible that this is related to my lizard man sighting. I also have to say that this encounter has definitely had a very lasting impact on me. It's something I still think about, even after all these years. I'm just very curious to know what I saw. I would be interested in hearing any other stories, theories, or sightings of a similar creature. It had a very reptilian face, the long snout, green scale-like skin. Eyes were deep set in and dark. The very muscular forearms, I remember. That's not something you forget easily. And after working law enforcement for so many years, it's something that I think about very, very often. So, as I said, I want to know what this is, where it came from. If anybody reading this or listening to this has had an experience like this, or if they know anything more about the lizard man, I want to know. Since that night, I've had nightmares about that thing. I developed a fear of reptiles, which I didn't have before. It felt traumatic in a way. But overall, I'm very curious about it. I definitely think it's something that'll stay with me for a very long time. Let me just say that I have zero reason to make any of this up. You can ask my whole family. I was driving at 9:30 p.m. on a Friday night, December 29th, on Route 73 near Montgomery, Pennsylvania. It's basically right outside of Philly and not too far from Valley Forge National Park. There are some newish-looking condos there by the Art Museum that I always thought were weird. They said they'd be opening in 2010, but never really did, until recently. Anyway, it was dark out, but you could see pretty well since the lack of foliage around this time of year. So, as I'm driving westward, which is the direction most people go to get into Philly, I noticed something standing about 50 feet right off the road. At first, I thought it was a deer standing by the large cement base of one of those new condos, but as I got closer, I saw that this thing was humongous, at least 8 feet tall, at the bare minimum. It also had a very long tail that swayed back and forth, slowly under it, as it stood there, watching me drive past. It also did not seem to notice my car until just then. As soon as our eyes locked, for what felt like forever, it flinched really hard and took off hopping down the road towards the condos on 2 legs, squealing and hissing constantly. It looked, or reminded me, kind of like a large upright Komodo dragon, but more red. I couldn't tell if it had any fur or not, but I doubt it. It had a very long snout and large eyes. Its tail was easily 3 feet long, if not larger. And I remember the body, it was very bulky too. Once I pulled over after driving a bit further, I saw another one, peeking its head from around the back of those same condos. So now, there were 2 of them, hopping around and squealing as they ran between buildings. I called 911 to report it. Not sure if anyone believed me, but they said somebody else had already reported seeing the same thing I did, near that area that night. They told me nobody would come to investigate until Monday. I decided to go knocking on some doors in the area, asking people what they knew. Now, this is where things get weird. A lot of these people looked terrified when I mentioned it. Of course they would. One lady whom I spoke to, her window was right by where this happened. She got really pale and told me she couldn't help me with any information, but her next door would be able to. So, I found the person's number in the complex directory and talked to this older lady right away. She seemed eager for me to meet with her, so I went over there to meet her. She answered the door and she was terrified. She would not make eye contact with me or say anything. Just kept saying she needed to fetch something upstairs in her bedroom really quickly. She had me wait in her living room and bolted upstairs. I did not want to make her any more nervous by following her up there, so I waited. I looked at some family pictures while she was gone, but didn't really see anything strange about them. They were all of regular-looking people and scenery for the most part, but when she came back, she had this really large book in her hands. It was like an encyclopedia or something. She made eye contact with me and handed me the book. It was called Reptoids, a field guide to reptilian humanoids, and filled with pictures of these bizarre creatures who vaguely resembled humans. They were all wearing these strange clothing, almost like space outfits or something. They live right here among us, she told me. She said I could keep the book because she had no use for it anymore. It was a book that she had been working on herself, but to be careful and not tell anybody about what I was reading. It sounded like she was scared for her own safety, and it made me wonder if any of these reptoids might be living around. So, that's why I'm writing this to you. I don't know who to talk to about this or what to do with all this new information. I'm not sure if these reptoids are the same thing that were outside the window that night, but I can't ignore the resemblance. From what the woman had told me, is these creatures are underground aliens, or a part of a race. They feed on human flesh. I don't know though. Even though it feels like something really crazy is going on, nobody will take me seriously, That's why I've included things about this creature, information that hopefully you could use. I just hope somebody out there can help me make sense of all this. It's starting to feel like my world is turning upside down. I've given some thought to what you asked, and I believe the older lady's name was Catherine. Her place is in the Morningside condos on Wilshire Boulevard. I don't know if it helps any, but she did tell me several of her neighbors have been having odd dreams. All of them involving strange, seemingly foreign people chasing them down. Anyway, as for this book she gave me, it looks like it was printed long ago. It's an older publication and doesn't seem like anything that would be taken seriously by most people. After all, she said she had it for a long time, and there's only a couple copies. If there's anything else I can tell you, let me know. I'm still trying to make sense of all of this myself. When this happened, I worked the night shift. This was in a small factory just outside of Tampa, Florida. A group of us would spend the night there most nights just to get some extra hours in during the slow season. It was late one evening, and everybody else had gone home, except my boss, who was still working on something. I decided to stay a little longer to keep him company. Well, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. My boss informed me he was leaving, so I turned off all the lights in the building and walked out with him, locking up behind us. We went outside. I turned around at our silhouette, standing before us, when suddenly, right next to it but not touching, stood another creature, as if staring us down. My first reaction was initially fear, but as I studied it more thoroughly, I realized it was not aggressive at all, and appeared just as curious about us as we were about it. My boss was frightened by it. I was immediately fascinated. It stood upright like a person, but looked more like a large lizard standing on 2 feet. Its skin had a very dull appearance. Its head was proportioned with the rest of its body, not too big or small, and its eyes were these small black pearls that seemed to emit this darkness. The only light that night came from a nearby streetlight, which almost made the creature's skin appear off-white. It had 2 very short arms, each ending in 3 long fingers. Its legs appeared human-like and ended in large bird-like feet, each with 3 toes. I'd asked my boss if he had seen it, and his reply was, "Yeah, I got a pretty good look at it." He went on to tell me that the creature's eyes were glowing a bright red before walking away, although I never saw anything other than black. Even though I was able to see it up close, which is definitely the reason why I'm still alive today. The face of this creature had a large, white-crested spikes protruding from its forehead, an extremely large jawbone, kind of like a beak, and rows of very sharp, serrated teeth. I couldn't tell if they were armed with claws on their fingers or toes. It was hard to see in the lighting. It was difficult to tell exactly just how tall it was, since we were standing next to each other. But judging by my height, which is 5'8", and comparing it to my boss, who's about 5'10", I would say the other creature may have been between 6 and 7 feet tall. It definitely did not look like anything I'd ever seen before in my life. It's hard to describe, but again, it's like a cross between a human and a lizard. Like something you would see in a movie, but this was real, and standing right there. Even though I was fascinated, I was in shock, to say the least. It seemed that when it noticed our presence, the 2 of us caused it to mistrust us somehow, because after a second or so, it turned around and quickly darted off into the darkness. I had my camera phone with me, but by this time, it was already long gone. Even the creature's movements were very human-like, graceful, almost like a dancer, if that makes any sense. And it casually moved, like it had not a care in the world. I believe that it could have easily taken us out if it wanted to, but it kept its distance, though I don't think that was because of me. I believe it just really did not want to be seen. We were both in our own little world at that moment. It was just the 2 of us and this creature. It didn't look like anything we'd ever seen in our lives. It's hard to describe, really. I believe that this thing, whatever it was, it came from the swamps nearby. It's possible this thing was just passing by, but honestly, I don't know if I'll ever know, or if I'm going to want to. After that night, I went home and really spent a lot of time thinking about what this could have been, or what it was. After doing research on the internet, I kind of came up empty-handed. You see, there's not a whole lot of reports or people talking about seeing giant upright lizards. Fair enough, I guess. Which makes me wonder, is what I saw even real? Even though my boss and I were completely sober, and we both recount seeing the exact same thing. But honestly, whatever it was terrifying, although fascinating in the moment. I just hope we never come across it again. I don't know what it was doing there that night. Probably just passing through, and we just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time to see it. I really wish I would have never seen it. This is not a story of my own, but a story that was given to me to share with others. I did not go through it. In fact, it was my grandmother. She was driving on the road that goes to Cloudland Canyon State Park. It was right outside the canyon, and in a very secluded spot where nobody apparently drives after dark. She thought nothing of how quiet the road was until her car suddenly died a few hundred yards from the entrance to the park. She also made note of a strange magnetic feeling in the air, kind of like static. She found it very strange that her car had suddenly died. In fact, she told me she just got the car tuned up about 2 to 3 weeks prior. A new battery, transmission fixed, the works. Actually, I remember her putting down a lot of money to get her car fixed. It was in pretty bad shape, and it took a lot of us to convince Grandma to finally get it done. Anyway, that just supports the theory that her car and battery should not have gone out like it did, all of a sudden. My grandmother's also from that generation where they're pretty hardy people. My grandmother climbs out of the car, pops the hood, and begins seeing what happened. And just then, as she's doing this, she sees this giant, slime-covered creature coming out of the ditch, climbing onto the road, heading in her direction. She claims it was about 10 feet tall, covered in long stringy hair, and looked very reptilian looking. She said it looked like a monster, and was so terrified she ran back into the cab of the car and grabbed her revolver out of the holster. But she said when she turned her head to look back for it, it was already gone. Thinking it was close by, she clutched her gun and waited until help arrived. I'm not sure if she called a tow truck or OnStar or what, but eventually a truck arrived and brought her back to civilization. She claims it was easily one of the most frightening experiences she's ever had, and describes it like it looked like they came from the pits of hell. She even made note to me that the thing was very broad, and it had skin that looked like the texture of jello at some point. She said it was just standing there on 2 legs, almost swaying back and forth, watching her before it charged at her. Of course, once this happened, she lost it. She did not get a good look at its face, though. The whole entire sighting lasted maybe 30 seconds. I've done some further research of the entire area. There have also been a lot of Bigfoot sightings in this part, too. I'm not sure if they're related, but it is definitely strange when you add all the details together. I'd be curious to what you think about all this. If anything, I think it just further validates her experience. Again, my grandmother is a very hardy person. She has no reason to falsify a story like this. She gains nothing from it. There's no incentive for her. And every time she told me this story, which is probably about 4 times now, it's the same details every time, and her entire demeanor changes. She goes from calm, collective, and serious to very nervous and trembling at parts, especially when she recalls turning around and seeing this thing pulling itself up onto the road from the woods. She said she had never, ever in her whole life been that scared before. And this is a woman who had a very bad first marriage. A man who was so crazy, he had tried to run her over with his truck. That alone was traumatizing, but not as bad as seeing this thing. Now, before I go into my sighting, Let me preface this by saying that I've never seen anything like this before in my life, and to the best of my knowledge, neither has anybody that I've spoken about with it. So let me tell you about what happened. I was driving home from work late at night. It was around 11:15 p.m. I know that because even though I always get off work right about 10:45, it takes me a while to clock out and get all my stuff, get to my car and head home. Now, the road I was on was a quiet country road, right here in Davis County, Utah. And this is what happened. I saw what looked like a large black snake in the middle of the road, or so I thought at first. It was weird, and it was so large and kind of like a mass of a shape. I guess I'm not really sure why I initially thought it was a snake, but anyway, I slowed down, and as I approached and got closer, I could see it most was certainly not a snake, but a large black lizard-looking creature, standing up on its hind legs. It was at least 4 feet tall and had a long tail. It looked like something out of a horror movie, and the way it was standing in the middle of the road, I felt like it may have been trying to lure me out of my car. At least that's the impression I got. I pounded the gas pedal, speeding past it at about 80 miles an hour. When I looked in my rearview mirror, however, I saw that the creature had turned its attention to something else, off in the distance, and was standing there, facing it. It was at this point I felt like it might be too late for me, and this thing was going to catch up to my car and get me. Fortunately, that did not happen. Even though all those things went through my head, I made it home safe. Fortunately, I was only about 40 minutes away from home. As soon as I got home, I kept my hunting rifle close by and had no intention of ever driving that road, and from now on, I don't mind taking the longer route to and from work. I'm a 29-year-old white male, red hair and blue eyes. I'm 6'3", and I weigh around 215 pounds, although I had just lost 30 pounds this last summer. My teeth are very large, and I'm pretty insecure about it. My skin is not sensitive to sunlight at all, so I can stay out as long as I want in the sun and not have to worry about getting burned or turning pink. I recently moved to Omaha, Nebraska, and then, after a really bad toxic relationship, moved to Utah. I've always been interested in UFOlogy, but never expected anything like this to happen to me. On June 26, 2011, at about 11:30, I was driving to my girlfriend's house, and I had just turned off by Foothill Drive, and I saw something in the distance ahead of me that I thought was very strange. This whole area is very rural and kind of dirty. It leads to a lot of farms south of Layton, Utah. The first thing I did was slow down beyond the speed limit, look for signs of this thing, since it kind of disappeared. I thought it was strange. It wasn't until after I passed where it should have been that I noticed this tall figure standing up by a tree about 20 yards away from me. At this point, I noticed everything about it was wrong. Within about 50 feet of it, I could see it far more clearly. When I first saw the figure standing by the tree, I thought perhaps maybe it had been a person who was trying to flag me down or just get away from me, possibly a drug addict. But when I got close enough to look at it, I realized this thing was a creature. My thought then was maybe somebody had dropped off an escaped mental patient or an experiment, that this thing could possibly be a mutated human being. The figure was standing completely upright, and I could see it covered in these green scales from head to toe. It looked green but also kind of a dark color, like wet. Its eyes were small and black, and it had a long snout, several sharp teeth protruding from its mouth and jaws. But one thing I noticed as I was looking at this thing is that it was staring down at the ground, and I could not figure out why. By this point, I had come to almost a full stop, just trying to stare at this thing, and I had that moment, like the movie The Predator, where Arnold Schwarzenegger looks at the predator and says, "What are you?" That's exactly what my moment was like, staring at this thing. And then it must have realized I was looking at it, because it immediately lifted its head up, opening its mouth, revealing all these horrid teeth. It was as if I had offended it by staring at it, trying to figure out what it was. The thing let out this hiss, at least that's what I think it did, and began sprinting towards my car. It cleared half the distance in a few seconds. I immediately turned and floored the car, doing the whole wheel spinning and burning rubber, squealing out of there. When I kept checking back in my rearview mirror and passenger side door, I didn't see it anywhere around. When I got home, I immediately hopped on the internet to try and find out what I had seen, since who was going to believe me if I try and talk about it? I found articles about lizard people and other cryptids, but never did I ever expect to see one myself. I will continue my search and see what I can find, but I can't guarantee I'll see that thing again, let alone the fact that I even want to. My mistress and I were in a relationship for several months, in 2003 to 2004. She was a stay-at-home mom and would be with me when I toured my art galleries to keep an eye on the gallery, all while I attended to other business. It was during this time that she saw firsthand all of my personal experiences. I'm sharing this story because it is actually the very first one that made me feel afraid and has had the most profound effect on me. This happened way before I even knew what we were dealing with or who we were interacting with. My girlfriend's sister will remain anonymous, and her family does not know about our past history together, so please protect their privacy as well. Currently, we're living in Overland Park, Kansas. We're 40 and work in the public sector with adults with disabilities. I'm not sure what year it was, but I was in my mid to late teens. It was summertime and the sun wasn't setting yet. It must have been around 6 p.m. I remember looking at my watch when I heard this strange screeching noise. The noise reminded me like that of a woman or a child screaming. Right away it got my attention, so I looked up to try and locate any sound. When I looked up, I saw something that will stick with me for life. It's hard for me to describe this thing. It wasn't human. Its head was shaped like an upside-down triangle with bulging eyes. Its skin was pale and almost had no color. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. I could not move or run away. The thing began to get closer, so I put my head down and closed my eyes. I could feel this strange electrical sensation running all over my body. It was a tingling feeling. The screeching noise intensified, and the volume also got stronger. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get away from this thing. When I finally mustered up the courage to look back at what was happening, that's when it happened. A second entity appeared. We will call this one Entity B, for purposes of clarity. In a split second, this new creature morphed from a dark silhouette into a reptilian-like being. Entity B was identical to Entity A, except that it had strange markings along its flesh. I could not bring myself to look at the creatures for more than a few seconds. It was that terrifying. And after what seemed like an eternity, both of them just dematerialized right in front of me. I was traumatized from this. I ran inside the house and did not come out for days. I did not tell anybody about my experience for many, many years. And eventually, I confided in my then mistress. We both agreed it must have been some sort of demonic entity. This sighting alone has had a profound effect on me, and I believe that extraterrestrial entities are also involved. I feel like sharing this information now will be controversial, but I'm okay with that. I'd rather the truth get out there, and people be aware of these things' existence. I'm assuming that they were some sort of being, potentially interdimensional, potentially paranormal. Whatever they were, I feel like they were there to warn me, or at least do something bad to me. I'm not sure why they took physical manifestation in front of me, but whatever it was, I'm just glad I don't have to see them again. At least I hope not. It's been many years since that first encounter, and it still lives in my mind, all these years later. My first girlfriend, in 1981/1982, was a practicing white Wiccan witch, and had a job also as a librarian, which was interesting. She enjoyed researching things and read almost anything. I'm 58 now, so I was roughly 18 and 19 during this time period, and I just recently, after a phone conversation with a family member, recounted this story which happened during that time in a very rural Kent County, Michigan, where I lived with my parents on 40 acres. I had not moved out yet. How it all started. It was about 7 p.m. one evening, and I was reading a book or doing something. And I remember, I saw something that scared the absolute daylights out of me. The first thing that came into view was its face or head, then the whole upper torso, and it stood there staring at me. All I wanted to do was run, but could not move. I should mention that no part of its body was touching the floor. It had a very reptilian-like face, very lizard-like, eyes that were almost black, and then after maybe 10 seconds, it turned and walked off, out of view. I had caught it staring at me through the window. Well, turns out, my crazy girlfriend at the time actually practiced dark magic, and I guess she had summoned it against me because she had distrust with me, thinking I was talking to other girls and cheating. I dumped her, and I'm pretty sure she hexed me for a while, because I had some pretty crazy stuff happen to me in my early 20s. That's all water under the bridge now, but it still makes me wonder if that day what I saw was some sort of demon that she had sent after me. I served in the Marines back in the 1990s for a few years. I was a combat engineer for a while. I've been all over the world and have seen some pretty scary things. I now work as a contractor overseas. I was out deer hunting at night with my bow around 9 p.m. This was just outside New York City. It was November, so fairly cold, around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. I just climbed up a small hill to get a better view of the area that I was hunting in. As soon as I got to the top, I spotted something moving about 60 yards away from me in the woods. At first, I thought it was a large deer, but then noticed it looked all wrong. Whatever it was walking around on its hind legs, much larger than any deer I'd ever seen. It walked past the area I was just in and disappeared into the woodline on the other side. While I couldn't make out any face or distinguish what it was truly, I can tell you this: it had scales all over its body and looked reminiscent to a snake in the way that its flesh glistened and moved. I understand that what I'm telling you sounds crazy, but what I'm saying really happened. The entirety of the encounter lasted no more than 5 seconds, because it happened so fast. I was terrified upon seeing it, and it's been well over several months now. I can hardly sleep at night because of it. I'm glad I had at least some sort of weapon with me, because, quite frankly, there's no telling what that thing would have done had it caught me off guard and without a knife or a bow or a weapon of any kind. Has anybody else seen or heard of anything like this anywhere where they live? Or am I just that crazy old man that's seeing things out in the woods? I have a knack for spotting wildlife, and I'm very familiar with most of all of Missouri's fauna. I was deer hunting about a mile away from my house on private land. I've hunted this spot for easily 8 years now. I just climbed up on a ridge. I was watching some does feeding in a clearing when I saw the most unusual creature walking down the ridgeway, maybe 150 yards away, guessing. I immediately knew this wasn't a deer, hog, turkey, coyote, or bobcat. This thing was walking on 2 legs and had a tail. It was dark gray with a large head and seemed to have the same type of scales. The scales resembled those of a crocodile or an alligator. In fact, the whole thing looked like one, standing up on its hind legs. It was maybe 6 to 7 feet tall, but it's hard to say, judging from the distance I was at. I instantly froze up and became terrified. This creature looked up and noticed me, stopped and stared at me for a few moments before turning, bounding off into the woods. Its speed was incredible. I even tried to track it, but lost the trail in just a few moments. This whole thing has completely rocked my world, and I've not been able to get it out of my head since it happened. I've since thought about what I saw, and I'm quite confident that it was real. After all, I am a very avid hunter, fisherman, and I love the outdoors. I know what deer, hogs, coyotes, bobcats, etc. look like. This thing did not match any of those descriptions, not even a bear or any creature that I'm remotely familiar with. That's why it remains so puzzling to me. I was hunting on private land, as I said, by a ridge in Newton County, Missouri. The face also was a light gray, The mouth did not move at all. It had a very long snout and teeth that I could barely see, judging by the size. I don't recall seeing any eyes or ears. I wonder what it was. I don't think it was a Bigfoot. It did not look Bigfoot-y at all. At the distance I was from, I also did not notice any hair. The body shape was also bulky, and the tail was long and tapered. The legs were muscular, and it walked on 2 legs like a human being. I thought it was strange, though, when it stood there and stared at me. I was trying to identify what it was, and it knew I saw it. Almost like it was taunting me with its body language. Then it just disappeared and ran off. I've thought about this for years and years. I've never seen anything like it since. I'm still shaken up about it, even though I didn't notice everything that could help identify what it was. I can tell you, though, if I see anything like it again, I'll be sure to have a camera at the ready.